Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next live event. Just a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our guest. On the top corner, you will see a question and answer. If you have any questions, please feel free throughout just to type them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. And if we don't get to yours, don't worry. We'll get the question answered, and we'll send you a note afterwards. So obviously, we're trying to be in communication with you all. Markets have been quite difficult, a lot of things going on, a lot of headlines. We want to make sure that we're getting in front of you so that you can hear from our experts and who we're talking to. And we're lucky enough to have Angelo Katsoras with us. I had the opportunity to meet with him a couple of weeks ago out in Montreal. Great session, and so we're looking forward to a good session and overview. Angelo is a featured speaker at many conferences throughout North America and abroad. He's frequently asked to speak on the subject matter expert around geopolitical events. And obviously, we're in an environment we were so used to open borders, globalization, and we find ourselves in a very different situation where everybody seems more about borders and constraints and tensions between different countries. So, Angelo, you're being kept very busy, I'm sure, these days. So thank you for joining us. And Angelo, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Everybody, as they mentioned, I'm a geopolitical analyst at National Bank, and what I'm going to be discussing, as we'll see on the next slide here, will be number one, discuss the war in Ukraine, what its impacts on Europe's geopolitical landscape is. Number two, how China's-U.S. relations continue to worsen. And I'll also be focusing on some of the challenges related to transitioning to green energy within the United States and North America, and the double-edged sword with regards to natural gas exports on an international basis. Now, I'll start with Ukraine on the next slide here. Now, there's been a lot of questions whether there's hopes for peace negotiated somewhere in the near term. Unfortunately, when you look at it right now for the time being, it's hard to be optimistic because if you're the Ukrainians, you want to gain as much territory as you can before the winter approaches, and you think you'll be in a better negotiating position if and when these negotiations were to turn out. If you're the Russians right now and you lost a lot of territory, starting negotiations now would be like admitting you lost a lot of territory. And the fact you're going to have these illegal annexations coming up in the next few days makes it even more complicated, right? There's also the dynamic that ironically the better that Ukraine soldiers do on the ground, the worse it can be sometimes for Ukraine, because if you can't rely on your soldiers, i.e. Russia, what do? You do mass bombings of the cities. You knock out the electricity, you knock out the dams, you knock out the water supplies. And there's only one thing worse than actually doing that right now, would be doing it when it's minus 30. Right, and Russia's also looking to weaponize winter. Right, they're going to try to put pressure on Europe to be less supportive of Ukraine. They're going to put more pressure on Ukraine itself through the attacks on the infrastructure. It'll be much more challenging for Ukraine to get access to fuels to fuel its war machine. Right, and so you have these dynamics playing out where I think at least until winter, I don't see much of a chance of even indirect talks. Right, because winter is a way for Russia to weaponize, right? And I also think it's important to take into account that even if the war was to end tomorrow, and we would of course get a relief rally in the markets, I think it's important to realize that the suspicions between the two sides would continue for years, if not decades. Europe would still try to disconnect itself from Russia because they don't trust them. Russia would do the same by trying to rejig its infrastructure to be connected to China, for example, for natural gas, right? And these things can last a very long time going forward. Now, if I go to the next slide here, this is just a bit of an example of what we have in mind for Russia trying to weaponize winter. This is a poll taken back in May when you asked Europeans, should you spending more time on Ukraine or worrying about their own country people? Well, in this poll back in May, 40% people said, look, you're spending a bit too much time on Ukraine, not enough on us. So, one could imagine as winter approaches and the pressure and economic and energy related pressures increase, this type of pressure among the Western population could increase in the governments to push for a peace deal or give Russia some negotiating leverage, right? And so I think that's why for the winter I don't see any progress on talks at all, because they're looking to weaponize it. And if you look back at Russian history, whether it's Napoleon or Hitler, winter's being used as a weapon. This is not the same, but there's a connection to that. Now, if we go to the next slide here, this slide here just shows basically how much more Europe's paying for natural gas than North America. And you could have the same slide, by the way, for electricity, where it's several multiples higher. Now, it's important to realize in a world that's becoming increasingly automated, okay, electricity is the new labor in terms of analyzing what region or company is the most competitive. That means that what I recommend when you look at things from an investment perspective, when you're doing due diligence, one of the things you look at is the energy cost that companies or regions are paying, right? Because this is going to be very important in defining their competitiveness, especially in a world that's becoming more and more automated. Now I'll jump here to the next slide. Now this map here of Europe's energy infrastructure with relation to natural gas really highlights the challenges, because a lot of these pipes have been built over decades going into Europe. Okay, now when it comes to Europe, they not only have the challenge of trying to find new oil and gas supplies, they have to rejig their energy infrastructure. They have to build new pipes going into Europe. They have to build new storage facilities, new LNG terminals. This is going to take a very, very long time. So, and this is the challenge for Europe, because on the one hand, they're going to try to encourage a lot of these companies to develop infrastructure. But on the other hand, Europe's been telling us that, in 10 years, we're not going to use natural gas. So if you're a company and you're going to say, okay, I'm going to spend 5 years building it, 10 years to 15 years to get my money back, but you're telling us we're not going to use natural gas in 10 years, what am I going to do? I think that what's going to have to happen is Europe's going to have to financially compensate these companies if their assets do become stranded. This is going to be very expensive, but it's a lot less expensive than a multi-year energy crisis. When you also look at this map, you see the opportunity from an infrastructure perspective, because you're going to have to invest a lot of money in equipment and infrastructure. But I would say I would avoid, for example, the utilities, because the utilities now, they've been given price caps, government interventions, government takeovers, and as what any political analyst will tell you, there's no such thing as a temporary price subsidy or temporary price cap. Once these things get put in place, they tend to last decades, right? So it's something where in this sector, you focus on the equipment providers. They can sell the equipment and wash their hands of the regulatory and political risk of having to raise prices and deal with the political backlash, for example. Now I'll take you to the next slide here. The next slide here is also very important, because it focuses on what I call the risk of deindustrialization. The chart here on the left shows that aluminum production has been declining literally every month for the last several months. And you could have a same chart for fertilizers, for smelters. And the question is, how much of this is going to be temporary and how much of this is going to be permanent in Europe? And I think there's going to be a significant chance a lot of this is going to permanently migrate to other parts of the world. The picture on the right-hand side shows us, Mittal's steel operations, cutting operations in Europe, but increasing them in North America, for example. Right, and you're seeing Tesla, delaying their decision to build a factory in Europe, and focusing more perhaps on North America. And this means when you look at Europe from an investment perspective, I would focus on those companies that I say that I call European in name only. Those companies that not only export abroad, but have a lot of their production abroad. So they're cushioned from the impact of these very high energy prices. They're going to take a long time to deal with, right? And so it's a way to, if you look at Europe, you look at those companies that are abroad. So you reanalyze that asset allocation, right? Where you might not like the region, but you might like some of these companies that are deconnected. So for example, when you look at Toyota really Japanese. It exports a lot abroad and a lot of its production's abroad, right? And so it's a way to take some of the companies from this region that are perhaps deconnected from its primary weakness, i.e. high energy costs. Now I'll take you now to the next slide here. This is an important slide because when we look at Europe's energy challenges, we tend to focus a lot on natural gas, dependence on Russia. But this is a slide showing how much France is importing electricity right now. And this is important because France has traditionally been a major electricity exporter to Europe. Right now, about half of France's nuclear reactors are offline because of maintenance, because of extreme weather events. Now, France has promised that they're going to get these reactors online in the next 3 or 4 months. But anybody who's familiar with the nuclear sector, particularly in the Western world, I actually can't name the last time I remember a nuclear reactor that's been repaired or built on time. They usually tend to be months or years behind schedule. And so for me, if France is not able to get these reactors online, it risks making a bad situation even worse on the energy front in Europe. So it's one of these countries I'm taking a look at. And they're complicated by the fact that for many years we told people in France and in Europe and with the West in general that the nuclear sector was in decline, right? And so people went to get educated elsewhere. Now they're searching for nuclear engineers. The average age is 70, welders, right? They can't find them. So, and don't forget also, even if you say that you're going to go nuclear, once you've shut something down and actually closed it, it can take 15 to 20 years to build, right? The time it's finished, I'll be doing this presentation from an old age home, right? And so that once you've shut these things down, it's very hard to go back. So that keeping an eye on France and whether they get these reactors online is something that will help me decide whether the energy crisis goes from bad to worse. Now I'll take you here to the next slide. The next slide is it's interesting because what I call it the irony of ironies, because anybody who's familiar with the European crisis back in 2008, Germany was the strong country lecturing the very indebted countries in the South, saying, you guys are irresponsible, we don't want to socialize the debts. This time around, the positions are reversed from an energy front. So if you look at the map here, most of the LNG terminals are in some of the most indebted countries, Spain and Portugal, and now they have the energy. And now you have some of the Spanish government ministers now lecturing, Germany, saying, unlike other countries, we weren't irresponsible from an energy point of view, right? And so this kind of switches the positions, right? Where, you better keep buying our bonds or don't push us too hard in reforms because you need our gas, right? And so now Germany's asking for the gas supplies to be shared. And there's always the risk that if energy supplies become tight this winter, that countries like Spain will prioritize their own markets over that of other countries, right? Similar to what happened during COVID. We all remember during COVID, what happened? Many countries hoarded equipment and supplies, right? So there's the risk of the same dynamic playing out. Now I'll take you here to the next slide. Now this is a slide that's what I call a bit from the blast from the past, because back in 2014, this is the former leader of NATO. They warned Europe that they allege that Russia was financing anti-fracking groups in Europe in order to prevent Europe from becoming independent in natural gas production, in order to remain dependent on Russia. 2 years later, Germany, France, Netherlands all banned fracking. This is despite the fact Germany had been fracking since the 50s, right? And so it's a kind of a warning that perhaps went unheeded, right? And so 10 years later, we're seeing some of the ramifications of this. Now I'll take you here to the next slide. Now, the next slide is what is the political discontent arising from these difficult times, right? And the first example we're seeing in Europe is the election of a new government in Italy on the far right of the political spectrum. Now, the first point the first impact this could be is on Ukraine. Now, they've said they're going to be more pro-Ukrainian, but there's a good chance they're going to be less pro-Ukrainian than the prior government. So if you look at the quote on the second bullet by one of the leaders of the coalition parties in that new government, he says, yes, we want to defend Ukraine, but if the sanctions hurt us more than Russia, there's a problem. And Russia's counting on more and more people to have these kind of phrases or sentiments as the winter approaches. There was also a kind of an indirect threat by the president of the European Commission, shown here on the third bullet, where she said, look, if Italy doesn't go our way, we have means to sanction them or whatever, right, if they go in the wrong direction. The problem is that it's hard to really analyze in Europe who's following economic reforms or not, because most of these countries are more indebted than before. They're now nationalizing, they put in price caps. And a lot of the stronger countries that would have been, meaning more the countries put in place discipline, are not as strong as they once were, right? And so this will be the challenge. Now, with relation to some of the recent events in UK where the pound collapsed and the bond yields jumped after they made those unfunded tax cuts, from a political perspective, this is an example of where over the last 10 years or so, politicians in the Western world have become conditioned to spending more and not really worrying about a market reaction because rates were so low and there was no reaction to it. So simply put, you could put your hand on the oven and you wouldn't get burnt, right? And you could keep doing it and there was no reaction. Now they're finding out when you do put your hand on the oven, you are getting burnt. And the transition to dealing with this new reality that many politicians haven't dealt with for 10 years or so, will be very difficult from a psychological perspective to make the transition, right? And this is going to be a challenge. So, just to put this in perspective, for example, in the UK after this, what the main opposition Labour Party, which will probably win the election in a year or so, they came out, criticizing the government in power, but then put in a plan to spend even more money, right? So it's going to be hard to break this dynamic. And the risk from if you're a political party, as I've always said, that the political party that's unlucky enough to be in power in any Western country when they're finally forced to cut deficits and debts, they're probably going to be, in the political penalty box for 10 or 15 years, right? It's going to be like a game of musical chairs, right? You're not going to be sitting in that chair when and if this moment arrives, because in the West, we've kind of forgotten how to make these difficult choices because rates were so low for so long. But this will be a challenge that many politicians are going to be facing, right? And I think UK is a leading indicator of this. Now, just to kind of finish on the European section, when you look, when you look at Europe and you compare it to, say, North America, our advantages are tremendous. Okay, Europe's surrounded by many countries with political instability around it, not just in the east, but in the south as well. We're surrounded by oceans. Our energy costs, what I call the new labor in terms of defining competitivity, are much, much lower. We have the oil and gas reserves. We have farmland and water. We have mineral resources. We just have to develop them. We as a country, in Canada, the United States, we can move a lot quicker because it's one country. In Europe, they always have to get unanimity in many cases. And that's kind of like herding cats, right? And so when you look at all these factors in this difficult global economic environment, you still see that North America has many strengths when you compare that to many other regions of the world. Now, I'll take you now here to the next slide here.
Sorry, Angelo, just before we go on to the next slide, there is a question still about Russia and Europe. Did you want to pose the questions later, or did you want to address them right now when you're on?
Sure, whatever you guys want to do. I can.
Amy, what do you think? Should we?
Yeah, so the question is, this is a quick one, so one you can address. So obviously you have got a lot of Russian men fleeing the country right now, and they're running to the neighboring countries. Do you see some sort of impact on those neighboring countries? Like, what will the situation be unfolding by accepting?
Well, you know what? It's. I'm not sure they'll be impacted directly because maybe they'll get pressure to repatriate them. But I'm not. I think Russia has enough to deal with right now that they're probably not, they're just going to let it happen and be very angry. But what it does for me is that it highlights there's probably more people fleeing than currently fighting in the Ukrainian army in terms of people. But it highlights the difficulty Russia's going to have in getting competent troops because even the ones that are going to show up in Ukraine, they're going to be there either for the money or the paycheck, right? As opposed to Ukrainians fighting for their land, right? But there's a risk in this because as I mentioned earlier, the worse these troops do because they're not very motivated, the more the temptation to resort to mass bombing, right? In terms of like damaging the infrastructure. So it shows the weakness of Russia, but there's also an element of danger for Ukraine because if your soldiers don't do very well, you rely on just using old Cold War era bombs to do the damage. But there will be tensions with some of these countries, but I think for the moment Russia has enough on its enough is occupied enough by Ukraine not to really say anything to them, because could you imagine trying to enforce this or say to repatriate them all, right? And will these countries refuse? Will they accept, right? So I think they're going to focus a lot on Ukraine right now, maybe deal with that further down as the years go by.
Thanks for that, Angelo.
Now I'll go to the next slide as well. Now, the next area I'm going to talk about is China-U.S. tensions. Now, we've kind of been a bit desensitized to tensions over the years because we've heard so many about U.S. putting in, sanctions on China and vice versa. But I think right now we're entering into we're into unprecedented territory because in the recent act that was passed, the CHIPS and Science Act, where basically the U.S. decided to, we provided subsidies to build semiconductors in the United States to the tune of $50 billion or so. There was a clause in this legislation that said if you take the money to build plants in the United States, you cannot build advanced semiconductors in China. This is something that we've never seen before, right? And so this will set a precedent for other sectors as well whenever there's financing involved. And it also sets the stage for even more restrictions. So for example, in an earlier version of this bill, there was a legislation that just got pulled out in the very last moment that would have forced all companies investing abroad in countries of concern to go through a committee for approval. Okay, and to put this in perspective, that would have meant that if Tesla wanted to build one more battery factory in China, they would have had to get, ask for permission, and there's a good chance they wouldn't have got it. Now, I think in the next year or so, there's a good chance that this more restrictive legislation I just talked about has a chance of being passed. And what this really means is that companies in the most strategic, American and Chinese companies in the most strategic sectors, they're really going to see their market share decline in each other's markets, right? And so if you take the semiconductors, 20 to 30% of the revenues come from China. They're going to have to focus, American semiconductor companies are going to focus more on Western markets. They're going to have to focus more on subsidies to help them out as well. And that's why I think when you look at the $50 billion, it looks like a lot, but when it takes $15 billion to build a semiconductor plant, that's not enough. You're probably going to have a CHIPS 2 Act, a CHIPS 3 Act, right, going forward. And so you're going to see supply chains continue to be shaped by geopolitical tensions. And this means when you're analyzing companies, particularly those in strategic sectors, in addition to analyzing revenue and profits, you're going to have to analyze whether the geopolitical objectives of the country in question align with that company. And if they don't, they're not going to get the contract, right? So it's a way to look at it. So for example, Huawei had better 5G equipment, but because of politics, a lot of Western countries chose Nokia and Ericsson, right? So that's just one example among many. So that means when you're analyzing some of these sectors, you really look into the geopolitics of it to see who will get the contract in question. Now I'll jump here to the next page. Now I'll skip this one as well. Now this slide here goes a little bit to that difficulty of doing businesses in both countries, right? Because we're at a point where if you're an American company or a Western company in China, particularly in a strategic sector, if you follow U.S. rules, you're against Chinese rules, and vice versa. So what do? You try to perhaps put your own supply chain in China, so it's only for the subsidiary in question. But that might not be enough, right? That might be at a point where some of these companies might have to abandon some of their or sell off some of their operations. And I'll just give you a few examples of the difficulty. So you look at Tesla, Musk here, or Tesla on the left-hand side. Right now in China, the Tesla automobile is banned from several military installations and government buildings. And when high-level leaders meet in certain cities, they ban the Tesla car as well, because they claim that the sensors in the cars could be used to spy on them, right? Musk says, no, the data stays here. That's not possible. Some people say it's also China's positioning itself to get its local champions in this market. And then Musk is also getting pressure on the American side. There's legislation in the Congress currently saying that if you're a company and you want to continue to have access to NASA contracts, you can't have too much exposure to China, right? So you're seeing a company like Tesla being pressured on both sides. Now, another company that's really been kind of hit by both sides of this geopolitical rivalry is HSBC. HSBC, for those who are not aware, was the company that provided the documents that led to the arrest of the CFO of Huawei. Okay, now that got China very angry, needless to say. So in order to get back in China's good books, what did HSBC did? They supported the security law for Hong Kong. That got the West very angry, right? And so right now, one of its largest shareholders, this company called Ping An, it's a large insurance company in China, they're saying split it up, East operations and Western operations. And you wouldn't do this without Chinese permission, right? And so you're seeing examples of this. And I think in a few years, we're going to see examples of companies that are perhaps going to have to make a decision of what market they focus and what market they decide to neglect, right? Now I'll jump here. I'll skip this slide as well. Now, this next slide here is in relation to to subsidies that are being provided to electric vehicles in the United States in recent legislation. So $7,500. Now, there's nothing new about this, but what's new about these subsidies is the local content requirements. Okay, basically starting in 2024, half of the minerals and half of the components that that are made in electric vehicles in order to qualify for these subsidies have to be either mined or assembled in North America or an allied country. Now, this basically raises 2 points. Okay, number one, the West has gone from basically trying to criticize countries in the developing world from having local content requirement rules to basically saying if you can't beat them, join them. So now China's going to have these rules, India has these rules, so is the United States, and so is Europe, and so will Japan. And this means that in terms of supply chains, in addition to having your supply chains reshaped by geopolitical tensions, they're going to be reshaped by the ever-growing local content requirements spreading all over the globe, right? So it's one more reason where you're going to perhaps have higher operational costs because of that, because efficiency will take a second place in terms of the importance. Now, the second thing to look at is the deadlines. Okay, when you look at these deadlines, they're very ambitious. But then when you realize, so when you go to the next slide here, when you look at this, you're saying to yourself, this is almost impossible for any country to meet these requirements, because look at the top left-hand corner, America almost mines none of what they need to, for the green energy transition in terms of electric vehicles. China mines a lot more, and what they don't mine, they control a lot of the companies. And then when you go to the refineries in the top right-hand corner, America even refines less than Europe, which actually surprised me, right? And so the United States is in a bit of a dilemma, because on the one hand, if you move as quickly as you can to meet your green energy targets, you're going to go from being independent in oil and gas to being dependent on the supply chains based from your number one geopolitical adversary. If you take your time to build up your supply chains, which could take years, if not decades, you're going to miss your green energy targets by an even wider margin than would have been the case, right? So this will be a big challenge, right? And a big dilemma going forward. Now, you'd say to yourself, we're going to try to rush permitting or get it done, and the problem is that we're not seeing mines being approved at any faster pace. So if we go to the next slide here, you can see in the United States, despite this very ambitious local content requirement rule, we're seeing less and less mines being permitted, right, being accepted. And I think the challenge in the West is that we've had we've gone, for many years, many people in the West have equated mining with environmental degradation, particularly the younger generation. And now we're turning around and telling them we need the mines to finance the green energy revolution, right? And so we're sending these contradictory messages. It's going to be a challenge. Now, if you're having difficulty getting mines up and running in North America, who are you going to look to? What region? It's going to be Latin America. So if you go to the next slide here, Latin America has many of the minerals that are crucial for the green energy transition, right? And so if you take just copper, for example, Chile, Peru, and Mexico account for 40% of the world's copper supplies. But the problem right now with South America is that a combination of new governments, political uncertainty, political unrest, regulatory uncertainty, potential for tax increases, the rejigging of the approval process means you're slowing down the approval of these mines, right? And so, for example, in Chile alone, they've recently canceled 6 mines because they want to redo the approval process. These mines will eventually go through. The long-term demand trends are too good, but you will have slowed it down by several years more than would have been the case under different political circumstances. And this means that while the current global economy really is putting pressure on some of these commodities in the shorter term, when the economic cycle turns, there's a potential that we're setting ourselves up for due to political resistance to getting mines up and running in the developing world and challenges in Latin America for tighter supplies, in some of these crucial commodities for the green energy transition over the longer term. Now, I'll take you here to the next slide. Now, this is just regarding Taiwan and tensions surrounding Taiwan. Now, this chart for me is it's what I consider to be two opposing geopolitical trends. Because on the one hand, China is getting stronger militarily, economically, but on the other hand, as you can see from the right-hand side, the Taiwanese feel less and less Chinese every year, right? So these two trends are going to crash into each other. And the question is, as you can see on the next slide, is whether an invasion is imminent. I don't think an invasion is imminent, in the near term, but I think we're now in a new era where we're going to see much more aggressive military exercises. And ironically, the visit from Pelosi probably gave them a good excuse to practice an invasion, practice a blockade. I think both sides realize even a minor outbreak, would really shock the economy, especially if you broke up the global supply chain. But I think there is the risk several years down the road that if China comes to the conclusion that there's no peaceful reunification, the risks increase significantly. And one of the things to keep an eye on is China's ability to build the most advanced semiconductors. For the moment, they can't. They have to import them all from Taiwan. So even during this tension, they never touched any of the supply chain with sanctions because they need them too much. If we see reports Taiwan and China is making advancements in the most advanced semiconductors, there's more of a reason to be worried, right? So that's one of the things I'm keeping an eye on. Now, if we go to the next slide, if you look at Chinese strategy, you're just taking a page from The Art of War. The goal is to basically to win the fight without fighting, because once you get involved in the fight, the damage is tremendous, even if you win. And I think one of China's strategies would be a blockade. Given that Taiwan imports 98% of its food and 60%, 98% of its energy and 60% of its food, you could bring it to its knees in weeks, right? You cut the internet cables, for example. Maybe there's some sleeper cells in there of 10,000 people or so that would take over key installations in Taiwan as well. And the question would be, what would America do? Would they put in place financial sanctions? Would they put in place a counter blockade of China? But given the fact China accounts for 25% of the world's electronic and electrical imports, this would have more of an impact in the war in Ukraine by several multiples, right? And so that would be the challenge, right? What would America do to a blockade? What would be the impact, right? And I think it's important to take into account Taiwan is literally 100 miles from China. It's what people drive to go to their cottage, right? It's just, it's that close. And from the Chinese perspective, that when the Civil War occurred in 1949, the nationalist side, the losing side, fled to Taiwan. In their view, Taiwan would have fell a day after they decided to attack it if America had intervened with Navy ships, right? So they felt that natural progression of things was stopped, right? And so China has an obsession with this that perhaps in the West we don't fully appreciate. Now, if we go to the next slide here, sorry, you can see what I call the tyranny of distance, because America's, military installations are thousands and thousands of miles away and dispersed all over the world, while China's are concentrated around Taiwan, only 100 miles away. And it puts the U.S., if hostilities were ever to break out, it puts in the U.S. in what I call the ultimate lose-lose situation, okay? If you do decide to defend Taiwan, if China was to attack, you have the possibility of entering into a major war with a nuclear-armed superpower, and you might have Americans wondering what you're doing fighting for an island 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. If you don't defend Taiwan, in the eyes of many countries in the world, particularly in Asia, there's a new global superpower in the region, right? And so from America's perspective, it almost seems like a lose-lose situation. Perhaps in 10 or 15 years, if America develops a strong semiconductor sector, especially on the advanced end, and maybe they'll say it's not worth defending Taiwan because we've developed our advanced semiconductor sector. But in the meantime, Taiwan remains highly important. So it's an important region to keep an eye on going forward. Now I'll jump here to the next slide. And I'll pass this slide as well. Now, this slide is focused on America's LNG exports. It shows how much America's LNG exports have increased since 2015 from literally 0 to 13 or 14% of their production. Now, Biden has promised that they're going to export as much as they can to help Europe defend against, to replace, Russian natural gas supplies. But from the political perspective, there's a challenge, because the more the United States exports abroad, the more you connect natural gas to the global markets, and the more prices rise in the United States just before the midterm elections, okay? Prices are much lower in the US than they are in Europe, of course, but they're also 3 times higher than they've been. And just before the war, you had many senators writing letters, including companies as well that use lots of natural gas in the chemical sector, for example, saying, look, limit how much you sell, because the more you sell abroad, the more it becomes expensive for us. Right, and this is a challenge that America is going to be dealing with as the winter approaches, spikes, if the price does spike for natural gas, because you get political pressure to limit it. Now, if you go to the next slide here, this is an example of countries that have dealt with this pressure. So you have Australia, who's recently said, look, prices are spiking in our country. We might want to limit the LNG exports. Norway was also mentioned this with relation to its hydroelectricity exports. And at the quote at the very bottom of the page, you had recently a bunch of Northeastern governors who wrote a letter saying it's great that you're supporting Europe, but we could also use some of these LNG supplies as well, right? Could you please prioritize us? So the pressure will pick up if prices do increase, right? And I think for natural gas, it's important, it's important to focus on it because I think it's going to get much more appreciation. Natural gas, there's great global demand for natural gas, but it's only partially fungible on an international scale. Natural gas is crucial as a, when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, as a backup. It's crucial input for fertilizer, chemicals, aluminum production, right? So I think we're at a point where we've underappreciated for a very long time. It's something to keep an eye on, looking for, from investor and a geopolitical perspective going forward. Now, in the very last slide here, this is just a quick overview on the U.S. election. For a while, it looked like the Republicans were going to have a red wave, and then they, they did their best to lose and try to, or attempt to lose. We had the Trump controversies and the recent, ruling on the abortion issue. But it still looks like they're gonna flip the House of Representatives. I think that's a near certainty, but it won't be as big as margin as before. So we're going to have a divided government, and when you have a divided government, you govern by executive order. But there's one exception. If there's anything that has China, that's related to China, they both opposing sides tend to put down their weapons, pass it, and go back to hating each other. Okay, so anything with a China focus will pass. You could probably say the same for Russia as well, right? So I think that's from an investment perspective. You say, yeah, it's gridlock, with the exception of China-related or Russia-related legislation. So that, in a nutshell, is my presentation. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, Angelo. That was a real trip around the world in 30 minutes. And boy, oh boy, how do you sleep at night with all the stuff going on and all the unrest? It's and again, to your point, this is what our team has been talking about when we look at it from an investment perspective for our clients. Is it's another lens in which we have to review our individual investments of what makes sense in the portfolio. So being mindful of what's going on in the world from a geopolitical standpoint is more important than ever before. Sean, I think you've got a few questions queued up.
Well, I have one, Angelo, and it's kind of relates to what you're talking about in terms of reallocating productive capacity around the world based on potential geopolitical forces. Apple announced that they're now going to produce the iPhone 14 in India. And it's interesting, I know you could touch on it, you did in this presentation, but what role does India play in the geopolitical forces that are evolving around the world?
India is a crucial country, which is seen as a crucial counterbalance to China in the region. So there's two important things from a geopolitical perspective. America wouldn't dare, for example, sanction India for contravening Russian sanctions. They're too important to get angry. From the economic perspective, you're going to see a lot of companies, hedging their bets and moving some of this production to India. Right? And the challenge, will be to get, in India can have some problems with getting approvals and getting these things up and running at, in a timely manner. But you're going to see India benefit from this, right? And so I think it's a country that will benefit from this politically and perhaps economically as the geopolitical supply chains rejig themselves. And there's also a longer term trend that we saw in China. Okay, there's many of these big countries, they have to make this choice, because the more you industrialize, the less you can stay independent in terms of food. Okay, because you use land for the factories, you use land for the semiconductors to build the cell phones, etc. So in 2000, China imported about $5 billion worth of food, and now they import 200 billion. And as goes China, will go India. Okay, and so India is going to have to make that choice as well, right? What you're going to use, you have less farmland, you have to use precious water supplies for the semiconductors or the phones as well. So I think that's a long-term trend. In many respects, I think our most precious foreign currency reserves are not found in the central bank in Ottawa. I think over the longer term, they're found in our farmland.
Interesting. Okay. And I think related to this, Angelo, and a question was kind of posed related to this question. There is a trend, I think, afoot, and correct me if I'm wrong, where U.S. companies and Canadian companies are trying to onshore their manufacturing processes. In general, how long will that take to come to fruition? Like, for instance, if Tesla wanted to onshore their productive capacity from abroad to the United States, typically how long would that take? And And what kind of investment would that take for them to achieve this?
The challenge with, as you saw with from the chart we showed, all the refining and things like that, is that bringing this stuff back and getting approval is a very time-consuming process. I think the International Energy Agency said that, for example, from the discovery of a copper reserves to actually getting them online is about 16 years. Okay, I'm not saying that, and so then, for example, the United States, they've been trying to get lithium plants up, new lithium mines up and running, but there's been resistance. So some of the movements that have been against oil and gas are against, for example, the lithium mines as well, right? And this will be the challenge, right? Getting social acceptance, right? To get these mines up and running, right? And I think in the West we don't have an appreciation, like we've forgotten what it is to produce things, right? And just even for example for medicine, you take a blood thinner. Blood thinner, just a 1 kilogram blood thinner can require over 1,000 pig intestines, right? These are things that require massive footprints to get them up and running. And so building the refineries, there's resistance to that, right? And so that'll be the challenge, right, to getting the societal approval. And as I mentioned in the presentation, many people in the West have, equated mining with environmental degradation, but now we're telling them we need the mines for the green energy transition. And for many people that doesn't compute, right? It's like it seems like a contradiction, but it'll be a challenge, right? I think that will be a challenge going forward, trying to get these things up and running in a timely manner and getting societal approval for them. Even for rare earth mining, for example, which is crucial for inputs. So that's going to be that's the challenge, right? For this, like there's one lithium mine in North America only, and they still have to send it back. Right. And just to put it from a geopolitical perspective, the United States right now has some rare earth mining, which is crucial for all alternative energy and IT products, but they have to send the minerals back to China to get refined. So the American warships are relying on its number one adversary for the magnets needed for its ships to confront its adversary in the seas. Right. It's not a very good place to be in. Right. And so I think this is another example of geopolitics analyzing geopolitics. Sometimes some of these companies are too important to fail. In 2011, rare earth prices collapsed, right? We followed the capitalist principles, and let it collapse. China didn't. They subsidized it. They got to control the market, especially on the refining side. Mm-hmm. This time around, if rare earth prices collapse, the United States or the Western countries, you can't afford to let these things go bankrupt. You have to support them financially, right? Because it's just too crucial for your national and economic security. So there's another investment wrinkle. What's too geopolitically important to fail? I.e. semiconductors, i.e. some of these rare earth mines that are trying to get up and running, for example.
Well, Angelo, may we live in interesting times.
Yep.
Angelo, Angelo, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
So we had a question from one of the clients. How long will it take for companies like Tesla and energy companies to move production factories into North America?
Well, a little bit what we said before, it could take a very long time, right? You have to, when you're talking production, it's not just you're talking about the assembling of the components, right? But if you look at the local content requirements, they want the mining, right? And I have a report I wrote about a year and a half ago showing how long it takes getting mines approved. Right. And then you have the refineries. Not a lot of people like refineries in their backyard either. You got to get the approval for that. Right. And so this is a years and years long process. And as I mentioned, the International Energy Agency, which is a very pro-transition organization, they said that the average year of getting mine up and running in the world for copper in the last 15 years or so is 16 years. So it's a challenge, right? It's going to be a challenge. And that's why it throws Latin America in such an important position. But the challenge for Latin America, from America's perspective, is that when you exclude Mexico, Latin America trades much more with China than it does with the United States. So they have a big geopolitical footprint there in this region, which is going to become increasingly important, given that they have the production that is needed for the green energy transition in terms of mines.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, Angelo, thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining in. Hopefully you found this of interest, and Angelo, I'm sure we're going to have requests to have you back again. As a reminder, everyone, we have recorded the session. We will send it out to you all in case you couldn't make the whole event. Also, please remember, we do have our podcast. We are posted on YouTube as well. We had one we posted out yesterday, just giving you an overview of the market and things we can do in this environment. And as always, any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us and happy to connect. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.